Well, good evening, ladies and gentlemen. You know, this is a community service of the Italian American Museum. We're very interested in preserving our historic places, places that mean something to our community and are of great significance. It's our privilege to this evening have this presentation, which hopefully will find its way to the right places and hopefully make a difference for the future, for this wonderful endeavor. There are many stories like this, and I've heard them over and over again of places that have been lost. This would be a tragedy if this was lost to our community, not only to the Catholic community, but for the community of New York, because it is such a historic and wonderful place. You're going to be hearing from two wonderful speakers, from VERNA and from TAGLIA, who will tell us all about the history and what needs to be done. So the Italian American Museum welcomes you, and we're glad to be able to provide this setting to have this important symposium on the saving of Our Lady of Loredo.
We have Frank Napolitano owned the property where the church sits. Okay? He gave the property to Charles McDonald, who was the bishop at the time. And he gave it to him for $1, Vincenzo Sorrentino. He wanted to build a church that we know to look like a church, all right, instead of these other buildings that you saw previously, the wooden structures. So he wanted a real looking church. And again, he was in charge of the church when Frank Napolitano donated the land, and here we have one. All right, here we have now, Sorrentino wanted to build the church and he wanted it to be Italian in nature. Okay, Mario?
Okay, so Father Sorrentino, at that particular time in the 1880s when the immigrants came over, they wanted to worship according to their traditions, and the hierarchy at that time was Irish Americans, and they were very, they just were not familiar to the type of devotion that the Italian immigrants had, and they sort of, considered them almost worshiping in the Irish churches, and they wanted to do it in Italian. They were told to go to the basement. You will have your masses in the basement in your own language in the way you want it. And so Father Sorrentino decided that he was going to build a church that basically was going to tell the diocese that we can do it ourselves. We can have a church that is truly Italian. And to have the building built, he decided he was only going to bring in Italian workers. Okay, they were only going to be Italians. He's not saying that there's anything wrong with American craftsmen. He wanted this church entirely built by Italian immigrants, including the neighborhood men. And so he brought in this particular person. Adriano Armezzani was the architect. Okay, he came over to the United States in 1894. He had worked in Rome. He is from Rome. He worked on St. John's Lateran, St. Peter's Basilica, and also St. Paul outside the wall. So he had a lot of talent. He knew what he was doing. He came over here because he was contracted to work with Giuseppe Moretti, who was a sculptor. So here is the church of Our Lady of Loredo from a journal called Architecture. It is completely made out of concrete block. And what was they found, so it was innovative at the time, that it got written up in the journal Architecture, and it's still, they're talking about that particular church in the year 2003. It was brought out in the Construction History newsletter. Right over here, they still remember Federici Armezzani practically 100 years later. They're still talking about this particular church. And here we have the facade, okay? Now, the facade really has the work of all three men. Adriano Armezzani, who designed this, okay? And it's a very austere, very sharp, architecture. But it was the perfect medium for Gaetano Federici. He figured now we can enliven it with his statues, and you could see He's got St. Peter and St. Paul in the niches. He made use of it. And also he did 2 bas-reliefs. At the very top, we see his largest masterpiece in ornamental concrete. And it is, here you get a better picture, it is the house of Mary being translated from Dalmatia in Yugoslavia to Mary's house in Nazareth, had been moved to Dalmatia on the Adriatic coast. And as the Muslims were moving into the Balkans, the house was lifted up by angels and brought to Loredo. And the story is that one day the people woke up and they discovered this house suddenly appeared on their landscape. And so in 1906, or maybe just before it, a French canon, Ulysse Chevalier, came out with a monograph where he basically debunked this particular devotion, said it didn't happen. And of course it caused a lot of distress. And so here is this young Gaetano Federici who has to now deal with this. Here's the church that was called originally in 1890 when it was founded, Our Lady of Loredo. And he was going to deal with it, and he said, you know what, I'm going to put Our Lady of Loredo at the very top. I'm going to have that legend, that tradition showing on this particular church. And this, you see, is done in his studio. Okay, this is not, he didn't create this in Brooklyn. He created it in Paterson, New Jersey, and it was transported to Brooklyn. And this is in 1908, and there were no bridges over the Hudson River. So you can imagine how it was transported from Paterson, New Jersey to Brooklyn.
And the size was 30?
The size is 32 by 10. Okay, and here we see the strong figures of St. Peter and St. Paul. And they're very reminiscent of the style that we find at St. Peter's Basilica. Okay, very Bernini-like. The church was dedicated on April 5th, 1908. This is the very first issue of the tablet, April 4th, 1908. And they mentioned, right over here in the middle, the dedication of the Church of Our Lady of Loredo, which somehow got spelled with 2 T's. And it said inside their article that the new Church of Our Lady of Loredo is the most handsome edifice of its size in the state of New York and one of the most perfectly appointed edifices in this country. And so these are the words from the Diocese of Brooklyn.
And that's Charles McDonald, the bishop at the time.
Okay, and here we have the interior, and Marilyn, you're going to speak about the interior.
Serafino Biancardi was the interior decorator, and he was the one who decided on colors and lighting and what have you, where things should be placed for the best beneficial part. So we are in fact, Mario is in contact with one of the Biancardi relatives, descendants. All right. Gaetano Capone was the painter, and we haven't been able to ascertain a picture of him yet, but this is a painting he did on the cover of the book. Now, the stained glass. The stained glass was donated by different families, and here you have Tracy e Familia, and here's another one donated by D'Angelo. The stained glass makers were Morgan and Sons. Morgan and Sons started their firm in the middle of the 1800s. They did 8 churches in Philadelphia and 1 in Ohio. They did Our Lady of Loredo, the windows in Our Lady of Loredo, and they did St. Francis Xavier down in Park Slope, if you're familiar with that church, down in Brooklyn.
Actually, the very first time I saw this church, I realized that it was something special. And when I started joining the campaign, I knew this much about the church.